She sent a message that was supposed to end one man's lie. Instead, it started a war she never agreed to fight. One wrong digit, one cold reply, and by sunrise, an entire empire and soul thought she belonged to a stranger with blood on his hands. If you believe no woman deserves to find out she's been lied to for 4 years while watching someone else wear her future on their finger, hit like and subscribe right now. This story is for the ones who refuse to shrink after betrayal. Only the Daniels of the world won't smash that button. Amara had rehearsed the surprise 100 times in her head. She'd walk into the dinner Daniel thought was a boring investor thing, champagne in hand, and watch his face do that thing it did when he was genuinely happy. The small, crooked smile he saved for her alone. 4 years of birthdays, funerals, a broken lease, and one spectacularly bad tattoo he talked her out of getting, and she still thought that smile belonged to her. It didn't. It belonged to a woman named Sophie, who was currently wearing a diamond the size of a small moon and laughing at something Daniel said with the easy confidence of a woman who had never once had to wonder where her boyfriend was on a Tuesday night. Amara stood outside the frosted glass like a ghost at her own funeral, watching her future get repossessed in real time. She didn't storm in. She didn't throw the champagne, though God knew the bottle deserved better than what it was about to witness. She just stood there in her good black dress, doing the math on 4 years, and came up with a number that made her want to sit down on the sidewalk and never get up again. Grief has a strange sense of humor. It let her walk 2 blocks, hail no cab, cry no tears, and instead type the angriest, most dignified text message of her life. Tell your fiancé the truth, or I will. She read it twice. It was perfect. It was clean. It was the kind of line a woman says in a movie right before she gets her life back. She hit send with the confidence of someone who had, in fact, transposed the last 2 digits of Daniel's number 3 weeks earlier when he'd gotten a new phone and never bothered to fix it in her contacts. Because who double checks a number they've called 400 times? Fate, it turns out, keeps very precise records. And on this particular Tuesday, fate rerouted Amara's masterpiece of righteous fury directly into the pocket of a man who was having a considerably worse night than she was, which was saying something. Kingpin did not look like a man who was losing. Men who looked like they were losing didn't wear suits that cost more than most people's cars, and they certainly didn't sit in a penthouse with a view of half of Seoul like the city owed him rent. But there he was, staring at 3 photographs his mother had slid across his desk with the ceremonial gravity of a woman dealing tarot cards that all predicted the same doom. 3 women, 3 families, one deadline. Midnight, or the empire his father had spent 40 years building, would fall into the eager, well-manicured hands of his younger brother, Min-ho, who had been waiting so long to inherit something that at this point, it felt less like ambition and more like a hobby. Min-jae had negotiated hostage releases with more warmth than his mother currently showed him. Choose, Madame Yoon had said, the way other mothers said, eat your vegetables. Except the vegetables in this case were arranged marriages, and the consequence of refusal was mild financial apocalypse. He was 2 whiskeys deep and one bad decision away from doing something memorable when his phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. A message that had clearly not been written for him. Tell your fiancé the truth, or I will. Min-jae read it once. Then again, slower. The way you reread a sentence that's funnier the second time. Somewhere in this city, a woman he had never met was going to war over a man who didn't deserve the ammunition. He respected it. He respected it the way he respected a well-placed knife. Quick, clean, unapologetic. He should have typed wrong number and moved on with his very expensive, very miserable evening. That would have been the sensible thing. But Kang Min-jae had built his entire reputation on the principle that sensible was for men who didn't already own the room they were standing in. He looked at the 3 photographs on his desk one more time, looked at the message glowing on his screen, and felt something click into place that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with spite. He typed 6 words back, slow enough to feel each one land like a decision he couldn't take back. Tell him you're mine now. He hit send before he could talk himself out of it, set the phone face down on the desk like a man laying down a winning hand, and picked up his whiskey with the calm of someone who had just solved 2 problems with one very reckless lie, and had absolutely no idea yet how much that lie was about to cost both of them. Amara stared at her phone like it had personally insulted her ancestors. Tell him you're mine now. She read it 4 times, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the LOL wrong chat that never came. Her first thought was that Daniel had gotten drunk enough to lose his grip on both his fiancée and his grammar. Her second thought was that this was possibly the strangest, most unhinged thing anyone had ever said to her, and she'd once dated a man who kept a pet iguana named after his ex-wife. She typed back, thumbs moving faster than her better judgment could keep up with. "Who is this?" No response. Which, honestly, was worse than any response could have been. Nothing rattles a woman mid-meltdown like being ghosted by a stranger she didn't even mean to text in the first place. She stood on the sidewalk in her good black dress, champagne bottle dangling from one hand like a prop from a play she no longer wanted a part in, and decided that whoever this was, they were either a scammer, a lunatic, or, and this was the option she liked least, someone who actually meant it. She did not have time to figure out which, because 20 minutes later, the street outside Daniel's engagement dinner sounded like it was hosting a small motorcade for a head of state. 3 black SUVs eased to the curb with the kind of synchronized precision that suggested somebody had rehearsed this, or somebody was simply used to entrances being taken seriously. Valets froze mid-tip. A couple on a first date stopped arguing about the check to stare. Amara, still lingering outside like the world's most well-dressed loiterer, watched the back door of the middle SUV open, and out stepped a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a very expensive, very unbothered piece of granite. He didn't rush. Rushing was for men who weren't sure they'd be obeyed. He crossed the sidewalk in a handful of unhurried strides, shrugged off his coat without breaking eye contact with her, which, under different circumstances, she would have found deeply, embarrassingly attractive, and settled it over her shoulders like this was a routine they'd performed 100 times before. "I've been looking for you," he said. Loud, deliberate, pitched exactly so the words would sail clean through the restaurant's open door and land in the lap of every guest at Daniel's engagement dinner, Daniel included. Amara's brain short-circuited somewhere between "who are you" and "this coat smells expensive." The restaurant, mid-toast, went dead silent in the way only second-hand embarrassment can accomplish. Daniel turned. Sophie turned. Sophie's mother, a woman who had clearly been planning the seating chart since Sophie was in the 3rd grade, turned so fast her earrings nearly achieved liftoff. And there, framed in the doorway like the world's most inconvenient plot twist, stood Amara. Jilted, humiliated, and now apparently spoken for by a man in a several $1,000 suit who had never once introduced himself. Daniel's mouth opened, closed, opened again, doing an impression of a man trying to compute long division under duress. "Amara? What? Who is this?" "Someone she should have been with the whole time," the stranger said, not even glancing at Daniel, which was, Amara would later admit, an absolutely devastating way to insult a man without spending a single extra word on him. Sophie's mascara did not survive the next 90 seconds. Neither really did Sophie's evening. Engaged 1 hour, publicly humiliated the next. All because her fiancé had apparently spent the last 4 years failing to mention a girlfriend who now had a private security detail and zero patience left to burn. "You don't know me," Amara said quietly, once she'd found her voice again, once the ringing in her ears had died down enough to let words through. It wasn't a question. It was a warning, low and precise, the same tone she used on landlords and men who thought, actually, was a personality trait. "No," the stranger agreed, unbothered, like she'd complimented his tie instead of accused him of insanity. "But I meant every word I sent." He finally looked away from Daniel and down at her, and something in his expression shifted, amusement sliding into something quieter, harder to name. "Kangmin J," he said, like that was supposed to mean something, like the name itself came with a warning label she hadn't been issued. It didn't mean anything to Amara yet. It would, by morning, mean everything. To the tabloids, to his mother, to a shipping heiress somewhere across the city who was about to have the worst week of her carefully planned life. But right now, standing in a stranger's coat in the wreckage of her own engagement dinner disaster, all Amara knew was that she'd sent one text to the wrong number, and the wrong number had shown up in person to burn her old life down. Madame Yun arrived exactly 4 minutes after her son announced in front of God and every gossip columnist's dream audience that a strange woman in his coat was somehow his. She didn't storm in. Women like Madame Yun didn't storm anywhere. They arrived, the way weather arrives, the way a verdict arrives. Inevitable, unhurried, and impossible to argue with once it's in the room. She wore black, because Madame Yoon always wore black, a color she'd once described to a reporter as practical for funerals and business meetings, which in this family are frequently the same event. She crossed the restaurant floor with her heels clicking out a rhythm that made even the waitstaff find urgent reasons to be somewhere else, and stopped 3 feet from Amara, close enough to really look at her. Close enough that whatever she saw made the color drain clean out of her face, fast, like someone had pulled a plug. She finally came back, Madame Yoon whispered. The words weren't loud. They weren't meant to be heard by anyone but herself. A private collision between the past and whatever was currently standing in Amara's borrowed coat. But Min Jae heard it. So did Amara. And for one full second, the most feared woman in Seoul's underworld looked less like a queen and more like someone who'd just seen a ghost order dinner. Then, as fast as it had cracked open, the mask went back on. "We're leaving," she said to her son, in a tone that suggested the last 90 seconds hadn't happened, that a mother's entire face hadn't just betrayed 40 years of family secrets in a single sentence. "Now, bring her." Nobody asked, "Bring her where?" Nobody apparently asked Kang Min-jae anything. By the time Amara climbed into the middle SUV, because saying no to 3 black vehicles and a man who'd just publicly claimed her felt, in the moment, considerably harder than it should have, her phone had already started buzzing. A blurry photo of her standing outside the restaurant in Min Jae's coat had made it onto a gossip account with 200,000 followers, captioned simply, "Who is she?" By the time the SUV crossed the river, it had made 3 more. Here's the thing, nobody warns you about heartbreak. It's supposed to be a private catastrophe. You're supposed to get to fall apart quietly, in your own apartment, with your own ice cream, on your own time. Amara had planned on exactly that kind of collapse. Instead, she was somebody's headline before she'd even had the chance to cry. Which, and maybe this says something about the particular flavor of humiliation Daniel had cooked up for her, was almost funny. Almost. She was sitting in a stranger's car, wearing a stranger's coat, having just detonated a stranger's engagement dinner. And the worst part of her night wasn't even the strangest part anymore. If you've ever had someone rewrite your whole story without asking you first, a system, a family, an ex, who decided the narrative worked better with you as the villain, you already know how this feels. Comment "I see her" if you'd have taken that coat too. Because staying quiet has never once protected a woman from a man's lies. It just makes the lying easier. Across town, in an apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a city she was 3 days from owning half of, Ji-woo, daughter of a shipping dynasty, fiancé in waiting, a woman who had spent 11 months preparing to marry Kang Min-jae with the calm precision of someone closing a business deal, watched the same blurry photos circulate on her phone with an expression that would have frightened her own security detail. She didn't cry either. Women raised the way Ji-woo had been raised didn't cry over inconveniences. They made lists. By the time the SUV pulled through the gates of the Kang family estate, Min-ho was already awake, already dressed, already standing in the doorway of the main house with the particular stillness of a man who'd smelled opportunity from 2 rooms away and followed the scent like a hunting dog. He watched his brother step out first, watched the stranger step out after him, tired, furious, still wearing that ridiculous coat. And then Amara stepped into the porch light, and Minho went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. "I know her," he said, to no one, to everyone, his voice dropping the polished edge he usually kept sharpened for exactly these moments. He said it again, slower, like he was double-checking a memory he'd never expected to need. "I think I know her." Nobody answered him. In this family, Amara was learning fast. That was usually the loudest response of all. Morning arrived the way scandal always does. Too early, too loud, and completely uninterested in whether Amara had slept. She hadn't. She'd spent the night in a guest room the size of her entire apartment, staring at a ceiling with more architectural detail than her actual life, replaying the words she finally came back on a loop until they stopped meaning anything at all. By 6 a.m., her phone had 93 unread messages, 4 missed calls from her mother, and one very long, very unhinged voice note from her best friend that began with, "Amara, why are you trending?" and ended with, "Also, I need details. I have coffee. I'm coming over." Except Amara wasn't home to be come over to, which was its own small horror. By 7 a.m., she was famous. Not the good kind. The kind where every gossip outlet in the country had decided, without a single quote from her, that she was either a secret mistress, a long-lost heiress, or, her personal favorite, the mysterious woman who brought Seoul's most eligible bachelor to his knees in one night. One headline had actually used the phrase modern-day Cinderella, which felt deeply unfair to Cinderella, who at least got a pumpkin carriage out of the deal instead of a stranger's coat and a Mafia family's collective nervous breakdown. Daniel, predictably, had chosen violence. His texts arrived in a tone that suggested he was the wronged party, which took a special kind of audacity considering he was the one who'd gotten engaged to someone else without bothering to break up with Amara first. "So, this is what you've been doing behind my back? Wow. Guess I know who you really are now." Amara read it twice, laughed once. A short, ugly laugh with nothing funny behind it, and didn't respond. Some men needed silence more than they needed the last word, and Daniel had never once, in 4 years, earned the privilege of getting both. Downstairs, the Kang family was having a considerably worse morning than she was, which she found she didn't hate. Breakfast in that house was less a meal and more a hostage negotiation with better lighting. Madame Yoon sat at the head of the table, composed again. The crack from the night before sealed over so completely it was hard to believe Amara hadn't imagined it. Min-jae sat across from his mother with the particular stillness of a man who knew he was in trouble and had decided the best defense was looking extremely bored about it. And Min-ho, sharp-suited, sharper-eyed, a man who treated every family gathering like a shareholder meeting he intended to win, hadn't stopped watching Amara since she'd walked in. "I know her," he'd said the night before. This morning, he said nothing at all, which was somehow louder. "Sit," Madame Yoon told Amara. Gesturing to the empty chair like this was a completely normal Tuesday and not the second day of the strangest week of Amara's life. Amara sat. What else was there to do? Announced that she'd like to be returned to her regularly scheduled heartbreak. Please, this one came with too many additional villains. "You don't know who we are," Madame Yoon said. It wasn't a question, but Amara answered it anyway. "I know exactly who you are. You're the reason I'm trending for something I didn't do, in a coat that isn't mine, in a house I didn't ask to be in." She kept her voice level. 4 years with Daniel had taught her a lot of unfortunate things, but it had also taught her how to sound calm while internally on fire, which was proving useful. "So maybe you can explain why your son texted a total stranger 'you're mine now,' and why you looked at me last night like I owed you money from a past life." Silence. The good kind. The kind where you've landed a hit and everyone at the table knows it. Min-jae, to his credit, didn't flinch. "I don't have an answer for you," he said. And it might have been the first honest thing he'd said since this whole disaster started. "I sent that text because I was angry and reckless, and you sounded like someone I didn't want to leave alone in a fight you didn't deserve to be in. That's all it was supposed to be." "Supposed to be," Amara repeated. Across the table, Minho finally spoke, quiet, careful, like each word cost him something. "It's not just a text anymore, though, is it?" He looked at his mother, not at Amara, when he said it. "Because she's already here, and you already recognized her." Madame Yoon's hand tightened, just slightly, around her teacup. "Finish your breakfast," she said, to no one and everyone, and the room understood the way families do, that the conversation was over whether they liked it or not. Amara didn't finish her breakfast. She pushed the plate away, stood, and walked out onto the veranda before she said something to Madame Yoon that would have gotten her escorted off the property by men with earpieces, which, given the last 12 hours, felt entirely possible. The morning air was cold enough to be honest with her, which was more than anyone inside that house had managed. She wrapped her arms around herself and stared out at gardens that probably cost more to maintain annually than her entire education, and thought, not for the first time since last night, how did I end up here? One wrong digit, one furious, righteous text message meant for a cheating boyfriend who wasn't even worth the data it took to send. And now she was a headline, a house guest, and apparently a woman with a face that made a crime family's matriarch look like she'd seen a ghost order breakfast. Footsteps behind her. She braced for Min-jae, or worse, his mother again. But it was Min-ho who stepped out onto the veranda, hands in his pockets, wearing the kind of careful, measured expression of a man who'd rehearsed his opening line twice and still wasn't sure it was the right one. "You really don't know," he said. Not a question this time. "I really don't." Amara turned to face him fully. "But everyone in this family keeps looking at me like I'm supposed to. So why don't you be the first person in this house to actually finish a sentence?" Minho almost smiled at that. Almost. The way a man smiles when he's impressed against his will. "There was a woman," he said finally, "years ago, before my brother and I were old enough to understand what our father actually did for a living. She used to come to the house. My mother trusted her more than she's trusted almost anyone since." He paused, choosing the next words like they might explode if handled wrong. "Then one day she just stopped coming. No goodbye, no explanation my mother ever gave us. And nobody in this family has said her name out loud in almost 20 years. And you think I'm her? I think you look like her the way a daughter looks like her mother," he said. Which doesn't make sense, because as far as any of us knew, she never had children. Amara felt something cold slide down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Her own mother had died when she was 6, a fact she'd spent most of her adult life not thinking about too hard, because some doors, once opened, didn't close again cleanly. She'd been raised by an aunt in a version of the story that had always felt slightly too tidy, slightly too smoothed over at the edges, the way stories get when the people telling them are protecting you from something. "What was her name?" Amara asked, and hated how much her voice shook asking it. Minho opened his mouth to answer, and across the garden, a car door slammed hard enough to end the conversation before it started. Ji-woo did not walk so much as arrive, the way certain women arrive at the scene of their own public humiliation, dressed impeccably, jaw set, eyes doing the math on exactly how much damage control 11 months of careful planning now required. She'd woken up engaged, adjacent to a man who'd very publicly claimed a stranger in front of half of Seoul's press corps. And if there was one thing Jiwoo's family had taught her better than shipping logistics, it was that humiliation, left unaddressed, compounds like interest. "I'm not here to make a scene," she said, crossing the garden toward them with a calm that was somehow more unsettling than shouting would have been. "I'm here to remind everyone what was promised and to whom." Her eyes cut to Amara, not with anger exactly, but with the cool, assessing look of someone recalculating a business deal that had suddenly acquired an unexpected variable. "Whoever you are, whatever this is, my family didn't spend 11 months negotiating a marriage contract to watch it become a headline. If you've ever watched someone try to hold on to a life that was already slipping through their fingers purely out of pride, purely because letting go in public feels worse than losing in private, you already know exactly the kind of woman Ji Woo was becoming in that garden. Drop a comment below if you think she should walk away with her dignity intact, or fight for a man who was never really hers to begin with. Only the ones who've never had to watch their own plans fall apart in front of an audience will scroll past this without an opinion. Min Ho, to his credit, didn't get to finish his sentence. But the name he'd almost said hung in the air between him and Amara anyway, unspoken and impossible to unhear. Ji-woo left the garden the way she'd entered it, controlled, unhurried, and radiating the specific fury of a woman who'd decided losing gracefully was for people who hadn't already paid for the wedding photographer. She didn't slam the gate. She didn't need to. The silence she left behind did the job for her. Minho excused himself soon after, muttering something about handling this properly before his mother found out he'd said as much as he already had. Amara stood alone in the garden for a long moment, arms wrapped around herself, turning over the shape of a name she still didn't have. A woman who used to come to the house, who stopped coming, who my mother trusted more than almost anyone. It wasn't much, but it was more than 4 years with Daniel had ever handed her about her own life, which told Amara something uncomfortable about how long she'd been settling for people who explained less than strangers did. She found Min Jae in his study an hour later, not because she was looking for him exactly, but because the house had a way of funneling every uncomfortable conversation toward the same room, like it had been designed for confrontations instead of comfort. He was standing at the window with his back to the door, a glass of something amber in his hand, looking for once like a man who hadn't slept either. "Your brother thinks I look like a woman who used to work for your mother," Amara said. No preamble, because she'd run out of patience for preambles somewhere around her third gossip headline. "Your mother looked at me like I'd crawled out of a grave, and you sent a text to a total stranger and somehow turned it into a national headline." So I'm going to need someone in this family to start being honest with me. And I don't particularly care whose turn it is. Min-jae turned. For a man with a reputation for never flinching, he looked, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely unsettled. I don't know who you are, he said quietly. That's the truth. I've told you that already. Then why does everyone act like they do? He didn't answer right away, and in the silence, Amara noticed something she'd missed the night before. A section of bookshelf, slightly off angle from the rest. A hairline seam running down one side where the wood didn't quite match the wall behind it. She'd spent 4 years living with a man who hid things in plain sight. She'd gotten good, against her will, at noticing when a room was lying to her. What's behind there? She said. Not a question. Min-jae followed her gaze, and something crossed his face that looked almost like dread. A room my father kept locked his entire life. Nobody's opened it since he died. My mother has the only key, and she's never once offered to use it. Then how do you know what's in it? I don't. He set his glass down, and for the first time, he looked less like the head of Seoul's most feared family, and more like a man who'd spent his whole life circling a question he'd never been brave enough to ask out loud. But I think it's time somebody did. Getting the key took less negotiating and more nerve than Amara expected. A late-night conversation with Madame Yoon that started as an argument and ended, unexpectedly, with the older woman's hand shaking as she pulled a small brass key from a drawer she'd clearly avoided opening for longer than Amara had been alive. She didn't explain. She just handed it over, said, "Some doors should have stayed closed," and walked away before either of them could ask her what she meant. The bookshelf swung out easier than it should have for something that hadn't moved in decades, revealing a narrow room that smelled like dust and old paper, and something Amara couldn't name. The particular scent of time that's been sealed away on purpose. Inside, stacked with a care that bordered on reverence, were dozens of letters. Envelopes, yellowed at the edges, tied in small bundles with ribbon, gone brittle with age. Every single one addressed, in careful, deliberate handwriting, to Amara. Her full name, correctly spelled, in ink that had clearly been dry for far longer than she'd known this family, or this city, or this reckless, furious text message existed. Min-jae went very still beside her. That's not possible, he said, and for the first time since she'd met him, he sounded genuinely, completely afraid. Amara didn't answer. She was already reaching for the first envelope, hands trembling, because some part of her, the part that had spent 18 years being told a smoothed-over, too-tidy story about a mother she barely remembered, already suspected that whatever was written inside was about to make her entire life make sense for the very first time and break her heart doing it. The letter was dated 11 years before Amara's 24th birthday. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind of penmanship that belonged to someone who'd learned to write love letters like they might one day be evidence. My darling girl, it began. If you are reading this, it means I was never brave enough to find you myself, and someone else had to be brave for me. Amara sat down on the dusty floor of the hidden room without meaning to, letters spilling across her lap, and read. Her name, her mother's name, had been Grace. Not the aunt who raised her, but the woman underneath that story. The one Amara had been told died quietly, unremarkably, when Amara was 6. Grace had worked for the Kang family in her 20s, trusted enough to be family, close enough to fall in love with a man she was never supposed to fall in love with. Kang Dae-ho, Min-jae, and Minho's father, a man already promised by then to the woman who would become Madame Yoon. Grace had left before anyone knew she was pregnant. She'd raised her daughter alone, half a world away from Seoul, under a different name, protecting Amara from an inheritance that came soaked in danger and obligation both. She'd written letters for years, to a daughter she hoped would never need to read them, addressed to a house she'd hoped would never come looking. She died when Amara was 6, and the letters, the years of unsent apologies and unspoken love, had been the only part of the truth that made it back to Seoul, smuggled into Daeho's hands by a mutual friend, locked away by a grieving man who never found the courage to send them onward, and left, after his death, in the one room his wife could never bring herself to open. She finally came back, Madame Yoon had whispered that first night. Not a stranger's face, a ghost's. Amara looked up to find Min-jae watching her, and something in his expression had cracked entirely open. The careful, unbothered mask of a man who negotiated hostage releases over dessert, gone. "You're my father's daughter," he said slowly, like the sentence cost him something enormous to build. "Which makes you your sister," Amara finished, and the word landed strange and heavy in the small, dusty room, undoing every single thing either of them had assumed about that reckless six-word text. It should have felt like a loss. Instead, and this was the part Amara would spend weeks trying to explain to her stunned best friend over multiple bottles of wine, it felt like the first true thing anyone in this entire ordeal had handed her. A mother's love, finally proven real. A story, finally not smoothed over at the edges. A family that had been looking for her, quietly, desperately, for longer than she'd known there was anything to look for. Madame Yoon, when told, didn't cry either. Some habits ran in families that weren't even blood-related. But she held Amara's hand for a long time in the study that evening and said simply, "I loved her. I was angry at her for leaving, and I loved her anyway. And I never got the chance to tell her I understood why she ran." She looked at Amara like she was looking at a second chance she hadn't earned and wasn't going to waste. "I would like to give that understanding to her daughter instead, if you'll let me." Minho, once the shock wore off, laughed for the first time in the whole ordeal. A real laugh, sharp and disbelieving. "I spent a week convinced my brother had lost his mind over a stranger," he said. "Turns out he accidentally found our sister. I genuinely cannot decide if that's better or worse for this family's reputation." Jiwoo, to everyone's surprise, sent a single message once the truth broke publicly. Not bitter, not gracious exactly, but honest. "Glad it wasn't a betrayal after all. Wish someone had told me sooner. Good luck to you both." Amara respected her more for that message than for anything Jiwoo had said in the garden. As for Daniel, Daniel got exactly what he deserved, which was nothing at all. No confrontation, no dramatic reckoning, no satisfaction of watching Amara's life implode the way he'd clearly hoped it would when he called her a woman with a double life. He got silence and a headline that had nothing to do with him, and the slow, humiliating realization that the woman he cheated on had somehow ended up with a fortune, a family, and a story far bigger than the one he'd tried to write her out of. Amara framed the first letter Grace had ever written her. Not the coat, not the headlines, not even the brother she'd gained by accident of geography and one wrong digit. That letter was the thing she kept closest. The one that finally, after 18 years, told her exactly who she'd always been. The wrong number had never been an accident. It had simply been the only appointment fate had ever managed to keep on time.